Welcome to my Channel Deep Sleep Mission-DSM. As we begin, I would be delighted if you could share your location in the comments below. It's truly inspiring to witness how far this content travels and to connect with viewers from across the world. The GPS stopped working exactly 3 miles before Bodie. That should have been my first warning. But when you're a travel blogger chasing the perfect abandoned town story, you ignore the red flags. You tell yourself it's just bad cell service in the Sierra Nevada mountains. You convince yourself that the locals in Bridgeport were just being dramatic when they said, "Nobody stays in Bodie after dark. Nobody." I should have listened. Because what I found in that ghost town wasn't history. It was something that had been waiting for someone just foolish enough to ignore the warnings. Someone like me. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night. I wasn't alone in Bodie, and whatever was with me, it followed me home. The story is now going to start. My name is Sarah Chen, and I've been running a travel blog called Hidden America for about 3 years now. Nothing too fancy, just me with a camera and a beat-up Honda Civic, documenting forgotten places across the country. Small towns with populations of 12, roadside diners that time forgot. Ghost towns. That's what brought me to Bodie, California, on a crisp October afternoon in 2023. I'd been planning this trip for months. Bodie is one of America's best preserved ghost towns, a former gold rush boomtown that died when the mines ran dry. The California State Parks system maintains it in what they call arrested decay, keeping the buildings from falling down, but not restoring them. It's supposed to look exactly like the last residents just left. The drive up Highway 395 had been beautiful. Fall colors painting the eastern Sierra, snow already dusting the peaks. I'd stopped in Bridgeport for gas and a coffee, chatting with the station attendant about my destination. "Body?" He'd looked up sharply from the register. "You planning to camp up there?" "Just for one night," I'd said. "Get some sunrise shots, you know. The golden hour light on those old buildings should be incredible." The man had gone quiet for a moment, studying my face like he was trying to decide something. Finally, he'd leaned forward. "Miss, I've lived in this valley my whole life, 63 years, and I'm telling you, nobody stays in Bodie after dark, nobody." I'd laughed it off. "Come on, it's just an old mining town. What's the worst that could happen?" He hadn't laughed back. "Just, if you hear them calling your name, don't answer, and whatever you do, don't take anything, not even a pebble." Now, driving up the 13-mile dirt road to Bodie, his words felt heavier in my mind. The afternoon sun was already getting low, and the landscape around me had turned desolate. Sagebrush and dust, scattered bones of long-dead cattle bleaching in the desert air. That's when my GPS died. Not lost signal. Died. The screen went black, then flickered back to life, showing a map I'd never seen before. Streets that didn't exist. Buildings labeled with names in a language I couldn't identify. I pulled over and restarted it, but the same impossible map appeared. I turned it off and relied on the road signs. The first thing that struck me about Bodie was the silence. I'd expected quiet, sure, but this was different. No wind, no birds. Even my car engine seemed muffled as I pulled into the parking area near the museum. The town spread out below me like a movie set. Weathered wooden buildings lined up along dusty streets, many of them still containing the possessions their owners had left behind. The Methodist Church, the schoolhouse, the DeChambeau Hotel. All perfectly preserved, all perfectly empty. Or so I thought. I grabbed my camera gear and started walking down Main Street, my footsteps echoing between the buildings. The late afternoon light was perfect, casting long shadows that made every photograph look like a postcard from the Old West. But something felt off. It was the windows. In most abandoned places, the windows are broken, boarded up, or at least dirty. But in Bodhi, many of them were clean. Spotless, actually. Like someone had been keeping up with the housework. I raised my camera to photograph the DeChambeau Hotel, and that's when I saw it in my viewfinder. A curtain moving in one of the upper windows. Just a flutter, like someone had been watching me and quickly stepped back. I lowered the camera, staring at the window. Nothing. Just dark glass reflecting the sky. Wind, I told myself. Had to be wind, but there wasn't any wind. I continued down the street documenting the barber shop, the general store, the assay office. Each building was like a time capsule, filled with artifacts from the 1880s. Bottles on shelves, newspapers on tables, even meals left half-eaten on kitchen counters. It was fascinating, and increasingly unsettling, because the more I looked, the more I noticed things that didn't quite fit. Modern things. A plastic water bottle sitting next to a century-old ledger book. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt outside the livery stable. A cigarette butt that couldn't have been more than a few days old. Someone had been here recently. Someone was still here. I set up my tent behind the old firehouse, figuring it would give me some shelter from the wind that was supposed to pick up after sunset. The ranger station had closed at 5, and I was officially alone with one of America's most famous ghost towns. The silence was getting to me. I'd been to plenty of abandoned places before, but they always had ambient sound. Traffic in the distance. Animals, something. But Bodhi felt wrapped in cotton, like all the normal sounds of the world just died at the town limits. I tried to shake it off by staying busy, cooked dinner on my camp stove, downloaded the day's photos to my laptop, started writing notes for the blog post I'd publish when I got home. But as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky deep orange and purple, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. That's when I heard the piano. Faint at first. Just a few notes drifting on the still air. A familiar tune. Something I'd heard before but couldn't quite place. Old-fashioned, like a saloon song from the 1800s. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound down Main Street. It was coming from the DeChambeau Hotel. The building loomed above me in the darkness, its windows now black rectangles against the weathered wood. But the music was definitely coming from inside, getting louder as I approached. The front door was locked, of course. This was a state park, and tourists weren't supposed to wander around inside the buildings without supervision. But there was a side door that stood slightly ajar, and the music was calling to me like a siren song. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The piano music stopped immediately. Complete silence. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a lobby frozen in time. Dusty furniture, old photographs on the walls, a registration desk with the guest book still open to entries from 1882. But no piano. I searched the entire ground floor, my footsteps creaking on the old floorboards. There was definitely a piano in the corner of what had once been the saloon, but it was covered in dust and several of the keys were missing. It hadn't been played in decades. Maybe it had been the wind after all. Old buildings make strange sounds, but then I heard footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate steps moving across the floor of the second story, back and forth like someone pacing. I stood perfectly still, listening. The footsteps stopped, then started again, but this time they were moving toward the stairs. I got out of that building so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet, ran all the way back to my campsite, my heart hammering against my ribs. Logical explanations, I told myself. Old buildings settle, mice in the walls, thermal expansion. There had to be a rational reason for what I'd heard, but when I looked back at the hotel from my tent, I could swear I saw a figure silhouetted in one of the upper windows. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me jump. The creaking of my tent in the breeze, a coyote howling somewhere in the distance. and around 3 in the morning I heard voices, faint conversations drifting from the direction of town. Too distant to make out words, but definitely human voices. Multiple people talking and laughing, like a party was going on somewhere in the darkness. I unzipped my tent flap and peered out. The town was dark and silent, lit only by starlight. But the voices continued for nearly an hour before finally fading away. In the morning, I convinced myself I'd been dreaming. Stress and isolation could play tricks on your mind. I'd read about that. Solo travelers in remote locations often experienced auditory hallucinations. But when I walked into town to continue photographing, I found fresh footprints in the dust. Dozens of them. Boot prints and shoe prints, some that looked like they came from period-appropriate footwear. They crisscrossed Main Street, led in and out of buildings, clustered around areas where people might gather to talk. Like there really had been a crowd here during the night. I spent the morning trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was park maintenance crews. Maybe other photographers or researchers had permission to be here that I didn't know about. Maybe there was some kind of historical reenactment group that used the site after hours. But the footprints looked old. Not just the style of shoes, but the impressions themselves. Like they'd been made in wet earth and then dried over time, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. She glanced around to make sure no tourists were listening. Voices, music, lights in buildings that should be empty. We've had campers pack up and leave in the middle of the night more times than I can count. But you don't believe in that stuff, right? Janet was quiet for a moment, then leaned closer. Honey, I've worked at this park for 15 years. I've seen enough things I can't explain to keep an open mind about what's possible. I spent the afternoon reading about Bodhi's history. The boom years, when 10,000 people lived here and the mines pulled millions of dollars worth of gold from the earth. The gradual decline as the ore played out. The fires that destroyed much of the town. The final exodus in the early 1900s, when the last residents simply locked their doors and walked away. But there were other stories too. Darker stories. A chapter about the unexplained disappearances that plagued the town even during its heyday. People who vanished without a trace, often after claiming they'd heard voices calling their name from empty buildings. A section about the echo phenomenon, where residents reported hearing conversations and music from the past replaying in certain locations. And one story that made my blood run cold. In 1883, a photographer named William Morse had come to Bodhi to document the declining town. He'd set up camp in the same area where I'd pitched my tent, behind the firehouse. On his third night, he'd written in his journal about hearing piano music from the hotel, voices in the darkness, and seeing figures moving through the streets. The next morning, his campsite was found abandoned. His equipment was still there, his tent still pitched, but William Morse was gone. They found his journal, but the final entry was strange. They know I'm here now. They've been calling my name, trying to get me to join them. But I understand what's happening. Bodhi isn't a ghost town because the people left. It's a ghost town because the people never left. They're still here and they want company. They want to show me something. I can hear them outside my tent right now, whispering my name. William, William, come and see what we've found. I think I'm going to go with them. I think I want to see. William Morse was never found. I closed the book and looked around the museum. Janet was helping a family plan their walking tour, pointing out buildings on a map. Everything looked normal, mundane, safe, but I was starting to understand that Bodhi wasn't like other abandoned places. The people who'd lived here, some part of them was still here, and now they knew I was here too. The second night was when everything changed. I'd moved my campsite closer to the parking area, telling myself it was for better cell phone reception, but really because I didn't want to be as isolated as I'd been the night before. Not that it mattered. My phone had stopped working entirely. No signal, and the battery kept draining even when it was turned off. I made dinner and tried to focus on editing photos, but I kept glancing toward the town as darkness fell, waiting for something to happen. I didn't have to wait long. The voices started just after sunset, distant at first, like they had been the night before, but getting closer. And this time I could make out some of the words. New one, camping by the firehouse. Been taking pictures. Time to show her. My hands started shaking. I zipped up my tent and tried to convince myself I was imagining things, but the voices kept getting clearer, closer, and then I heard my name. Sarah Chen. It was a woman's voice, sweet and melodious, calling from somewhere near the hotel. Sarah, come and see what we've found. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay in my tent, to ignore the voice, pack up my gear, and drive back down that 13-mile dirt road as fast as my Honda could carry me. But there was something compelling about the way she said my name, something that made me want to unzip the tent flap and step outside. Sarah, we've been waiting for you. I found myself reaching for the zipper. Stop, I told myself. Remember what the gas station attendant said. Don't answer when they call your name. But the voice was so lonely, so plaintive, like someone who'd been lost for a very long time and just wanted a friend. Sarah, please, we have something beautiful to show you. My hand froze on the zipper. That phrase, something beautiful to show you. I'd read it somewhere. William Morse's journal, the last entry. They want to show me something. That snapped me back to reality. I pulled my hand away from the zipper and pressed my palms against my ears, trying to block out the voice. But it didn't stop. Sarah, don't be afraid. We just want to share our secret with you. The secret of why we stayed, why we could never leave this place. Other voices joined in. Men, women, even what sounded like children. All calling my name, all promising to show me wonderful things if I'd just step outside. I grabbed my camera and started taking pictures through the tent fabric, hoping the flash would scare them away. But when I reviewed the photos, they showed nothing but darkness. The voices continued all night, sometimes close enough that I could hear breathing outside my tent, sometimes distant like they were coming from the far end of town, always calling my name, always promising to show me something. As dawn approached, the voices finally faded. I waited until full daylight before unzipping my tent. The ground around my campsite was covered in footprints, hundreds of them. Men's boots, women's shoes, children's bare feet. They circled my tent like people had been standing there all night, watching. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was my car. All 4 tires were flat, not slashed, just completely deflated, like the air had slowly leaked out overnight. And when I tried to start the engine, nothing happened. The battery was dead, even though it had been fine the day before. I was stranded. I hiked down to the ranger station, but it was closed on weekdays during the off-season. The nearest town was 13 miles away, over rough dirt roads. Too far to walk, especially carrying my gear. I had no choice but to spend another night in Bodie. That evening, I didn't even try to pretend I could ignore what was happening. I sat outside my tent with my back to the firehouse wall, camera ready, waiting for them to show themselves. They didn't disappoint. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, figures began emerging from the buildings, translucent at first like heat mirages, but growing more solid as the darkness deepened. Men in period clothing walked down Main Street, tipping their hats to each other. Women in long dresses swept porches and hung laundry on lines that shouldn't exist. Children played in the dirt with toys that had rotted away decades ago, and they all turned to look at me. Not threatening, curious. Like I was an interesting newcomer they were eager to meet. The woman who'd been calling my name approached first. She was beautiful, with dark hair pinned up in the style of the 1880s and a blue dress that rustled as she walked. But when she smiled, I could see the darkness behind her eyes. "Hello, Sarah," she said. her voice exactly as I'd heard it the night before. "My name is Eleanor. I've been waiting such a long time for someone like you." Someone like me? Someone who could see us. Most people just look right through us. But you have the gift. Other figures gathered around us. Men with weathered faces and calloused hands. Women with kind eyes and sad smiles. Children who giggled and played but never seemed to age. "We know you have questions," Eleanor said, "about why we stayed, about what happened to William Morse, about what's going to happen to you." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "What do you want from me?" Eleanor's smile widened. "We want to show you our secret. The reason we could never leave this place. The reason why Bodhi isn't really abandoned at all." She gestured toward the mine shafts on the hillside above town. "There's something down there, Sarah, something wonderful, something that makes it impossible to leave once you've seen it. What is it? Come with us and find out." The crowd of spirits began moving towards the mines, beckoning for me to follow. Eleanor extended her hand and I felt an almost overwhelming urge to take it. But then I remembered something else from the history books. The disappearances. William Morse. All the campers who'd left in the middle of the night. "What happened to them?" I asked. "The people who went with you before?" Eleanor's smile faltered for just a moment. "They found what they were looking for. They found a place where they belonged." "They're dead, aren't they?" The spirits stopped walking. The children stopped giggling. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Death is such an ugly word," Eleanor said softly. "We prefer to think of it as joining the community." I won't tell you how I got away from Bodhi. Not because it's too terrifying to share, but because I'm not entirely sure I did get away. What I will tell you is this. When dawn broke over the Sierra Nevada, something had changed. The spirits were gone, faded back into whatever realm they inhabited during daylight hours. But the town felt different, less hostile, maybe, but also less willing to let me leave. My car still wouldn't start. The battery was completely dead, and no amount of trying could coax even a click from the engine. But as I stood there in the growing light, frustrated and scared, I heard something that made my heart skip. An engine, coming up the dirt road from the direction of Highway 395. I ran toward the sound, waving my arms, and saw a pickup truck cresting the hill. It was an old Ford, probably from the 1970s, with a man behind the wheel who looked to be in his 60s. He pulled up next to my Honda and rolled down his window. "Car trouble?" he asked, though it was pretty obvious. "Dead battery," I said. "I don't suppose you have jumper cables." He studied my face for a moment, and I saw something in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "You spent the night here," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "And they talked to you." Again, I nodded. He was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a set of jumper cables. "My name's Frank Morrison. I live down in Bridgeport. Been making this drive up here once a month for about 20 years. "Why?" Frank climbed out of his truck and popped the hood. "Same reason you're here, I'd guess. Curiosity, except I learned a long time ago not to stay after dark." We connected the cables and he started his truck. My Honda's engine turned over immediately, like there had never been anything wrong with it. "That's impossible," I muttered. "It was completely dead." Frank disconnected the cables and coiled them up. "Lot of impossible things happen in Bodhi. The trick is knowing when to stop asking questions and just accept what you're seeing." I wanted to ask him more. How he knew about the spirits, why he kept coming back, what he thought was really happening here. But something in his expression told me he wouldn't answer. Some secrets were too dangerous to share with strangers. "Piece of advice," he said, climbing back into his truck. "Don't come back here alone, and if you do come back, don't bring anyone you care about." He drove away before I could respond, leaving me standing next to my mysteriously functional car with more questions than answers. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could and started down that 13-mile dirt road. But in my rearview mirror, I could swear I saw figures standing in the windows of the buildings, watching me go. And one of them looked exactly like me. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. When I developed my photos from those 2 days, they showed things that shouldn't have been there. Faces in windows. Figures walking down streets. Eleanor standing right next to my tent, her hand reaching for the zipper. And in the final photo I took, just as I was leaving town, there's something that makes my blood freeze every time I look at it. It's me, standing next to my car, but I'm translucent, like the spirits I'd seen. And I'm wearing a blue dress from the 1880s, just like Eleanor's dress. I've tried to convince myself it was a double exposure, a trick of the light, a malfunction in my digital camera. But deep down, I know what it means. Part of me never left Bodie. Part of me is still there, waiting by the firehouse, calling out to the next traveler foolish enough to ignore the warnings. The worst part isn't the nightmares, though those come regularly now. Dreams where I'm walking through Bodie's dusty streets in that blue dress, my voice joining the chorus calling out to new visitors. "Come and see what we've found," I hear myself saying, and I wake up with the taste of century-old dust in my mouth. No, the worst part is the pull. It started about a week after I got home to Sacramento. Just a gentle, tugging sensation, like someone had tied an invisible string around my heart and was slowly, persistently pulling me eastward, toward the mountains, toward Highway 395, toward that 13-mile dirt road I swore I'd never travel again. I fought it for months now, deleted the photos, well, most of them. Tried to forget Eleanor's face, the sound of children laughing in empty streets, the way the spirits had looked at me like I was already one of them. But the pull is getting stronger. Last week, I found myself browsing travel websites, looking at hotels in Bridgeport. Yesterday, I caught myself packing camping gear into my car without even realizing what I was doing. And this morning, I woke up and my GPS was set for a destination I never entered, Body State Historic Park. I deleted the destination, but it came back an hour later. Like the town itself was reaching through the digital world, trying to guide me home. Because that's what it feels like now. Not like I'm being haunted by a place I visited, but like I'm being called back to a place where I belong. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in my bed back home in Sacramento, I can hear voices from 300 miles away. "Sarah, Sarah, come back to us, Sarah. We're still waiting for you to see the secret. You belong here with us." And the terrible thing is, I'm starting to believe them. I've never gone back to Bodie. I've never even driven within 50 miles of it. But I have this terrible feeling that one day very soon, I will. And when I do, I don't think I'll be coming back alone, or coming back at all. So tell me, have you ever been to a place that felt like it was calling you back? Have you ever left somewhere but felt like part of you stayed behind? Because I'm starting to think that some places never really let go of the people who visit them. And here's something I haven't told anyone else. I've been getting messages, comments on my old blog posts from usernames I don't recognize. People claiming they've been to Bodie recently and seen a woman in a blue dress standing by the firehouse. A woman who looks exactly like me. She was calling out to us, one message read, trying to warn us about something. But when we got closer, she just disappeared. Another said, "I took a photo of the ghost town at sunset, and when I developed it, there was someone in the picture I hadn't seen when I was there. A young woman with dark hair, wearing old-fashioned clothes. She was reaching toward the camera like she was trying to touch whoever was taking the picture." I've tried to delete these messages, but they keep coming back. and each one includes details about Bodhi that only someone who'd been there recently would know. Changes to the buildings, new artifacts that have appeared in the museum, things that shouldn't be possible in a place that's supposed to be frozen in time. If you're ever driving through the Eastern Sierra, if you see those signs pointing toward Bodhi State Historic Park, maybe just keep driving. Maybe some ghost towns are meant to stay ghostly, but if you do decide to visit, if you can't resist the call of one of America's most perfectly preserved mining towns, just remember what the locals in Bridgeport will tell you. Nobody stays in Bodhi after dark. Nobody. And if you see a woman in a blue dress standing by the old firehouse, if she tries to warn you about something, or asks you to take a message back to the outside world, don't listen. Because that means part of me really did stay behind. And if I'm still there, still trapped between worlds, then the next person who spends a night in Bodhi might not be as lucky as I was. They might not find a way to leave at all. Let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced something unexplainable in an abandoned place. Have you been to Bodhi yourself? Have you seen things there that you can't explain? And please, please tell me if you've seen a woman in a blue dress, because I need to know how much of me is still trapped in that ghost town. Don't forget to subscribe, because I have a feeling this story isn't over yet. In fact, I'm starting to think it might never be over. Not until I go back and finish what Eleanor and the others started. Not until I finally see the secret they wanted to show me. Story number 2. Look, I know what you're thinking. Another tired driver, another mistake with directions. But I've been driving this route between Dallas and Austin for 8 years. 8 years of the same exit ramps, the same truck stops, the same mile markers counting down like a familiar heartbeat. I could navigate it blindfolded. So when that digital screen went black and I found myself staring at road signs I'd never seen before, well, that's when the real story begins. But first, let me ask you something. Drop a comment below and tell me. Have you ever noticed how Texas highways seem different at night? How the darkness swallows everything beyond your headlights, turning the familiar into something else? Because after tonight, I'm starting to think there's more truth to those old trucker warnings than any of us want to admit. Now, the story is about to begin. The whole mess started because of Jennifer's wedding. My sister, always the planner, had scheduled her rehearsal dinner in Austin for Friday night, with the ceremony Saturday afternoon in Dallas. Made perfect sense to her. Not so much to those of us driving back and forth across central Texas in a single weekend. I should have left Austin earlier. Should have listened when my buddy Marcus warned me about driving the back roads after midnight. "Dude, just get a hotel room," he'd said, nursing his third beer at the rehearsal dinner. Texas highways get weird after the witching hour. I'd laughed it off. Classic Marcus, always spinning some tall tale about his trucking days. But now, sitting in my Honda Accord with a dead GPS and no cell service, his words echoed in my head like a prophecy I should have heeded. The last thing I remembered clearly was passing through Round Rock around 11:30. The familiar golden arches of McDonald's, the bright shell of a gas station, the comfortable glow of suburban strip malls fading in my rear-view mirror. I'd grabbed a large coffee and a pack of gum, planning to power through the remaining hour and a half to Dallas. That's when the GPS started acting up. First, it was small things. The voice directions became slightly delayed, a split second behind reality. Then the map began showing roads that didn't match what I was seeing. Side streets where there should have been open fields, intersections that my headlights revealed as empty highway. I figured it was just a software glitch. These things happen, right? Technology isn't perfect. So I kept driving, following the route I knew by heart, trusting my instincts over the increasingly confused digital guide. But then the screen flickered and went completely black. I pulled over immediately, or at least I tried to. The shoulder seemed narrower than I remembered, barely wide enough for my car. When I stepped out to check my phone, the silence hit me first. No distant hum of traffic, no rustle of wind through trees, just an absolute quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. My phone showed no signal, not even one bar. That's when I looked around and realized I had no idea where I was. The highway stretched ahead and behind me, straight as an arrow, disappearing into darkness that seemed thicker than it should be. No streetlights, no distant glow of towns, no familiar landmarks. Just asphalt and the pale concrete of guardrails reflecting my headlights back at me. I got back in the car, hands trembling slightly as I turned the key. The engine purred to life, dashboard lights casting their familiar blue glow across the interior. Everything seemed normal, except for the growing certainty that nothing was normal at all. The road signs were wrong. Not missing, wrong. Instead of Dallas 87 miles or Georgetown 15 miles, I was seeing names I'd never heard of. Millfield 23 miles. Crow's Hollow 41 miles. Junction 7 miles. Junction? That was a real town in Texas, wasn't it? Way out west, near the hill country. But that would put me hundreds of miles off course, which was impossible. I'd been driving in a straight line north. I kept going, telling myself that I'd missed a turn somewhere, that I'd find a familiar exit soon, or at least a gas station where I could ask for directions and get my bearings. The coffee was keeping me alert, but something else was keeping me wired. A growing sense that the landscape outside my windows wasn't quite right. The trees, for instance. Texas has plenty of trees, but these seemed different. Taller, somehow. More twisted. Their branches reached toward the road like gnarled fingers, creating patterns of shadow that seemed to shift and move as I drove past. And the road itself. I'd driven thousands of miles of Texas highway, and they all had a certain feel. The particular way the asphalt caught your headlights, the familiar rhythm of expansion joints, the predictable spacing of reflectors and guardrails. This road felt older, ancient almost, like it had been here long before the rest of the modern highway system was built around it. Mile after mile passed without a single other vehicle. No truckers hauling loads through the night, no late-shift workers heading home, no college kids driving back to campus, just me and this endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through a Texas I didn't recognize. Then I saw the lights ahead. The town appeared suddenly, like someone had just switched on a light in the darkness. One moment I was driving through empty countryside. The next I was passing a weathered sign that read Junction, Pop, 847, in faded green letters. But this wasn't the Junction I knew. That town was small, sure, but modern, with a Dairy Queen and a couple of gas stations, the kind of place you'd stop for a quick bite while exploring the hill country. This junction looked like it had been frozen in time somewhere around 1962. The main street was lined with businesses that belonged in a museum. A Woolworth's with vintage red lettering. A Sinclair gas station with the old dinosaur logo glowing green in the fluorescent lights. A movie theater advertising Lawrence of Arabia on the marquee, as if it were still playing first run. And there were people. Not many, but enough to make me feel less alone. I could see them through the windows of an all-night diner, silhouettes hunched over coffee cups, a few figures walking the sidewalks, moving with the unhurried pace of small-town life. I pulled into the Sinclair station, my car's engine ticking as it cooled. The attendant who emerged from the office looked exactly like you'd expect from a 1960s gas station. Crisp uniform, name tag reading Earl, and a friendly smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Fill her up?" he asked, already moving toward the pump. Sure," I replied, climbing out of the car. "But I'm actually a little lost. Could you tell me how to get back to I-35? Earl paused, pump nozzle in hand. "I-35? Can't say I know that one, friend." "You mean Highway 35, that's about 60 miles east of here. 60 miles? That was impossible. Highway 35. Wait, that was what they called the interstate before it became I-35. But that was decades ago. No, I mean the interstate, I said carefully. Interstate 35, the main highway between Dallas and Austin. Earl's smile faltered slightly. Dallas and Austin are both a fair piece from here, son. You'd be better off heading through San Antonio if you're looking for the big cities. The numbers on the gas pump spun backward as fuel flowed into my tank. But they weren't digital numbers. They were the old mechanical kind, rolling over with tiny clicks. And the price, $0.32 per gallon. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. What year is it? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Earl looked at me strangely. 1963, of course. You feeling all right, friend? Maybe you should get some coffee at Mabel's before you get back on the road. 1963. The year JFK was assassinated. The year before the Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan. 62 years ago. I paid for the gas with a $20 bill, watching Earl examine it with the kind of curiosity you'd expect from someone who'd never seen modern currency. He made change from an ancient cash register that ding-dinged with each transaction. "Drive safe now," he said as I got back in my car. "And stick to the main roads. Lots of folks get turned around out there in the dark." I wanted to ask him what he meant, but something in his expression suggested he'd already said too much. The diner was my next stop. If I was losing my mind, at least I could grab a decent meal while figuring out my next move. If I wasn't, well, then I needed information. Mabel's all-night diner looked like every small-town restaurant you've ever seen in an old movie. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, a long counter with stools that probably hadn't been reupholstered since the Eisenhower administration. The waitress, Mabel, I assumed, had the kind of hairdo that required serious commitment to hairspray. "Coffee, honey?" she asked, before I'd even settled into a booth. "Please, and maybe some pie if you've got it. Apple or cherry?" "Apple." She poured coffee from a glass pot into a thick white mug that had definitely seen better days. The coffee was stronger than anything I'd tasted in years, with that distinctive flavor that comes from percolators and metal filters. The pie was incredible. Real apples, hand-rolled crust, the kind of dessert that restaurants don't make anymore because it's too time-consuming and too expensive. "Passing through?" Mabel asked, refilling my cup without being asked. "Trying to," I replied. I seemed to have gotten a little turned around. I was heading from Austin to Dallas, but I'm not sure where I am now. She studied me with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent decades reading people. "Austin to Dallas, huh? That's a long way from here, sugar. You'd need to head east to pick up the main highway, but..." She glanced toward the window, where darkness pressed against the glass like a living thing. "I wouldn't recommend traveling those roads at night. Not unless you know them real well." "Why's that?" Mabel's expression grew serious. "Roads around here get complicated after midnight, especially for folks who aren't from around these parts. You might want to consider getting a room at the motor lodge. Wait for daylight." Every instinct I had was screaming that something was deeply wrong here. But Mabel seemed genuinely concerned for my safety, and the coffee was warming me from the inside out, making everything feel a little more manageable. "What do you mean, complicated?" She leaned closer, lowering her voice even though we were the only people in the diner. "You ever heard the old stories about roads that move? Highways that take you places you didn't mean to go?" I shook my head. "Well, Texas is a big state with a lot of old roads. Some of them remember things. Remember when the world was different." She straightened up, professional smile returning. "But that's just old folks talk. Probably nothing to worry about." but her eyes said otherwise. I finished my pie and left a generous tip, partly because the service had been good, and partly because something told me I might need all the goodwill I could get. As I headed for the door, Mabel called after me. "If you do decide to keep driving, stick to the highway markers. Don't follow signs for places you've never heard of. And if you see headlights coming toward you that don't look quite right, pull over and wait for them to pass." I should have taken her advice about the motor lodge. Should have waited for daylight, gotten my bearings, figured out a rational explanation for what was happening. But something was pulling me back to the road, a restless urgency that wouldn't let me settle. Besides, how could I explain any of this to Jennifer? "Sorry I missed your wedding, sis, but I got stuck in 1963. She'd have me committed. The Sinclair station was closed when I drove past, though I could swear I saw Earl watching from the window." The main street of Junction faded in my rearview mirror like a scene from a movie, leaving me alone again on the highway. But this time, I paid attention to details. The road signs, for instance. They weren't just old. They were subtly wrong. The fonts were slightly different from what I remembered. The reflective coating caught my headlights at angles that didn't seem quite right. And the mile markers, they were counting in the wrong direction. Instead of ascending numbers as I drove north, they were decreasing. Mile 247, mile 246, mile 245, as if I were driving backward through someone else's journey. That's when I started to understand what Mabel had meant about roads that remember. This highway, it wasn't just a strip of asphalt connecting two points. It was a collection of memories, experiences, moments in time that had soaked into the very foundation. Every driver who'd ever traveled this route, every truck that had hauled cargo through the night, every family vacation and midnight escape, all of it was still here, layered beneath the surface like geological strata. And sometimes, late at night, when the world was quiet enough, you could slip between those layers. The headlights appeared around mile 231. At first, they looked normal enough. Two white lights approaching from the opposite direction, still distant but closing fast. But as they got closer, I realized something was off about their spacing. They were too wide apart, set into a vehicle that seemed broader than any truck I'd ever seen. I thought about Mabel's warning and pulled over to the shoulder. The vehicle that passed me defied easy description. It was definitely a truck of some kind, but massive, larger than any commercial hauler I'd ever encountered. The cab was tall and angular, with styling that looked like someone's idea of what trucks might look like in the future, or the past. But it was the trailer that really caught my attention. Instead of the usual rectangular box or tanker, this one was covered in what looked like canvas, bulging and shifting as if the cargo inside was alive. The driver didn't acknowledge me as he passed, but I caught a glimpse of his profile in the cab's green dashboard lights. He looked normal enough, just a working guy doing his job. Except for his clothes, which seemed to be some kind of uniform I didn't recognize, and the fact that his truck was making no sound at all. No engine rumble, no tire noise, no whoosh of displaced air. It glided past like a ghost, leaving only the faint smell of something I couldn't identify. Something organic and earthy and old. I sat there for several minutes after it disappeared, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just seen. Then I got back on the road, driving more carefully now, paying attention to every shadow and reflection. Mile 227, mile 226, mile 225. The landscape was changing again. The rolling hills were flattening out into something that looked more like West Texas. Wide open spaces punctuated by the occasional mesa or butte. But that was impossible. I'd been driving for less than an hour since leaving Junction, nowhere near enough time to cross that much terrain, unless time worked differently here. Mile 220 brought another town, this one even smaller than Junction. No sign announced its name, just a cluster of buildings huddled around a crossroads like they were trying to stay warm. A few streetlights cast pools of yellow illumination, but everything beyond their reach was swallowed by darkness, so complete it seemed solid. I didn't stop this time. Something about the place felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but hollow. Like a movie set that looks convincing from a distance but reveals itself to be nothing but facades and props when you get close. Mile 215, mile 214, mile 213. My gas gauge was hovering near empty, which didn't make sense. I'd just filled up in Junction, and my Honda was good for at least 300 miles on a full tank, but the needle was definitely pointing toward the red zone. That's when I saw the lights ahead. Not headlights this time, but the glow of another town. Bigger than the last one, with actual street lamps and the warm yellow rectangles of windows in buildings that looked lived in. The sign read, Cedar Creek, Pop 1827. I'd never heard of Cedar Creek, but right now it looked like salvation. I needed gas, I needed to get my bearings, and I needed to figure out how to get back to the world I knew. The town was busier than Junction had been, with actual traffic on the main street and people moving around with purpose. The gas station was modern. Well, modern for whatever decade this was. Clean pumps, bright fluorescent lighting, a convenience store attached to the office. I pulled up to a pump and climbed out, breathing deeply of air that smelled like prairie grass and distant rain. The normalcy of it was almost overwhelming after the surreal emptiness of the highway. "Nice night for a drive," said a voice behind me. I turned to find a woman about my age leaning against a pickup truck at the next pump over. She was dressed practically, jeans, boots, a light jacket, but something about her seemed out of place, like she didn't quite belong here either. "It's been interesting," I replied carefully. She smiled, and I noticed that her eyes held the same wary intelligence I'd seen in Mabel's. "First time on the night roads? Is it that obvious? You've got the look, that slightly shell-shocked expression that says you're starting to realize this isn't the Texas you thought you knew." She extended her hand. "Sarah Martinez, and before you ask, yes, I'm from around here. Sort of." I shook her hand, grateful for human contact that felt real and immediate. "Jake Thompson, and I have absolutely no idea where here is. Cedar Creek, Texas. Population 1,847, give or take, depends on what night you're counting." She finished filling her tank and hung up the nozzle. "Mind if I ask where you were trying to go?" "Dallas. I was driving from Austin to Dallas, and somehow I ended up wherever this is." Sarah nodded, as if this made perfect sense. The highways have been doing that more often lately, taking people places they didn't plan to go, showing them parts of Texas that exist, sideways to the regular world. "That's impossible. Is it?" She gestured toward the town around us. "Take a good look around, Jake. What do you see?" I looked, really looked this time, past the surface details that seemed normal enough. And slowly, I began to notice the inconsistencies. The cars in the parking lot were from different eras. A 1957 Chevy sat next to what looked like a 1970s Cadillac, which was parked beside a pickup truck that seemed much newer than either. But they all looked equally worn, equally real. The people moving around the station and the nearby buildings were dressed in clothes from different decades, too. A woman in a 1940s dress walked past a man in what looked like 1980s casual wear, neither of them seeming to notice anything unusual about the other. And the buildings themselves, they were solid enough, but their architectural styles didn't match. A Victorian house stood next to a 1960s ranch, which neighbored something that looked almost medieval in its heavy stone construction. "What is this place?" I whispered. "A crossroads," Sarah replied. "A place where different roads meet, different times intersect. Think of it as a rest stop between worlds." Sarah bought me coffee from the convenience store, and we sat on the tailgate of her pickup truck while she explained what she knew about the night roads of Texas. "My grandmother used to tell stories," she began, cradling her steaming cup between her hands, "about highways that existed before the interstate system, before the modern grid of roads that crisscross the state, old routes that followed Indian trails, cattle drives, paths that had been worn into the landscape by generations of travelers. The coffee was good, better than it had any right to be from a gas station convenience store. It tasted like it had been brewed with care, with attention to detail that most places had given up decades ago. She said those old roads never really disappeared. They just went deeper, became part of the foundation that the new highways were built on. And sometimes, late at night, when conditions are just right, you can slip from one layer to another." "But why me?" I asked. "I've driven that route dozens of times. Why tonight?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying the horizon where the first faint hint of dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. "My grandmother would have said it's because you needed to see something, learn something, that the roads only take people who are meant to be taken. That sounds like mystical nonsense. Maybe, or maybe there are more kinds of truth than the ones we're comfortable with." She turned to look at me directly. "Tell me about your life, Jake. Really tell me. What were you running from when you got in that car tonight?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. Because she was right, wasn't she? I hadn't just been driving from Austin to Dallas. I'd been running from something. Jennifer's wedding had been beautiful, perfect in every way. But watching my little sister pledge her life to someone, seeing the absolute certainty in her eyes as she spoke her vows, it had forced me to confront the reality of my own life. 32 years old, decent job, nice apartment, and absolutely no idea what I wanted from the future. I'd been drifting for years, going through the motions but never really choosing a direction. Never committing to anything or anyone deeply enough that I couldn't walk away if things got complicated. "I've been sleepwalking," I said quietly. "Just existing day to day without ever really deciding what I want my life to be." Sarah nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "And now you're here, in a place where you can't sleepwalk, where every choice matters because the wrong turn could take you somewhere you never meant to go." The sky was getting lighter, painting the eastern horizon in shades of pink and gold. With the approaching dawn, Cedar Creek was beginning to look less solid, less permanent. The edges of buildings seemed to blur slightly as if they were losing their grip on reality. "What happens when the sun comes up?" I asked. "Depends on what you choose," Sarah replied. "You can get back in your car and keep driving. Follow the highway markers back toward the world you know. Your GPS will start working again, your cell phone will find a signal, and by noon you'll be in Dallas wondering if you dreamed all this. Or you can stay a little longer. Explore what else is out there. See how deep these roads go, what other crossroads they lead to." She paused. "But I should warn you. The farther you travel from the main routes, the harder it becomes to find your way back. Some people get so lost in the side roads that they never make it home." I thought about my life in Dallas. My job at the insurance company, my sterile apartment, my carefully maintained routine that kept me safe and bored and slowly dying inside. What was I really going back to? But then I thought about Jennifer, probably wondering where I was. About my parents who would worry if I just disappeared. About responsibilities and obligations and all the mundane details that make up a real life. "There's a third option," Sarah said softly. "You can take some of this place with you. Let what you've learned here change how you see the roads ahead, even the ordinary ones." The sun broke the horizon just as she finished speaking, and I felt the world shift around us. The strange, timeless quality of the night was dissolving, replaced by the clear light of normal morning. Cedar Creek was still there, but it looked more conventional now, like any small Texas town you might pass through without a second glance. Sarah stood up and walked around to the driver's side of her truck. "Whatever you decide, you'd better decide soon. The road back only stays open for a few minutes after sunrise." I looked down the highway and saw it, the familiar green and white of an interstate sign in the distance. I-35 North, Dallas, 127 miles. The normal world was calling me home, but as I got back in my Honda and started the engine, I made a promise to myself. I wasn't going to return to sleepwalking through my life. The night roads had shown me something important, that there were always choices, always other paths to explore, even when they weren't visible on any map. I pulled out of the gas station and headed toward the interstate sign, but I kept one eye on the rearview mirror. Just before I reached the on-ramp, I caught a glimpse of Sarah's pickup truck turning onto a side road I hadn't noticed before. A narrow ribbon of asphalt that seemed to lead into the sunrise itself. By the time I reached Dallas, the whole experience was starting to feel like a dream. But I had the receipt from the Sinclair station in my pocket, dated 1963, and the lingering taste of Mabel's coffee on my tongue. And when I called in sick to work on Monday morning and started looking at job postings in Austin, well, that was the night roads teaching me that sometimes the most important journey is the one that teaches you to stop running from your own life. But I still drive through Texas at night sometimes. Still take the back roads when I'm feeling restless, because now I know they're there, waiting patiently beneath the surface of the ordinary world. And sometimes, if conditions are just right and I'm paying attention to the signs, I catch glimpses of places that don't exist on any map. Towns full of people from different decades, crossroads where time moves sideways, highways that remember every story they've ever carried. The roads are still there, friends, still waiting for travelers who need to see something beyond the straight lines between point A and point B. You just have to know how to look for them. And trust me, once you've seen what's really out there in the Texas darkness, you'll never look at an interstate sign the same way again. So tell me in the comments, have you ever taken a wrong turn that felt a little too right? Ever found yourself somewhere that didn't quite exist on your GPS? Share your stories below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more tales from the roads that hide in the spaces between the official maps, because I've got a feeling this is just the beginning of what those midnight highways have to show us. Story number 3. The GPS died exactly 17 miles from nowhere. That should have been my first warning to turn back. But 22-year-old me thought I knew better than a satellite system that had guided millions of travelers safely to their destinations. I was wrong about a lot of things that weekend. Dead wrong. What I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago, but I still wake up some nights with sand in my mouth and the taste of metal on my tongue. The doctors say it's psychological. But they weren't there. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't hear what's still echoing in the back of my mind. If you're planning a camping trip to the Mojave Desert, don't. Find somewhere else, anywhere else, and if you absolutely must go, stay away from the restricted zones. Trust me on this one. The story I'm about to share will change how you think about those government warning signs. It'll make you question what's really happening in those empty spaces on the map. So, grab something warm to drink, settle in, because this story is about to begin. My name is Jake Martinez, and I used to think the desert was peaceful. Used to think those endless stretches of sand and scrub brush were the perfect place to escape the chaos of Los Angeles traffic and college stress. Spring break was coming up, and instead of hitting Cancun like my roommates, I'd loaded up my Jeep Cherokee with camping gear and headed east toward the Mojave. The plan was simple. 3 days of solitude, some hiking, maybe catch a meteor shower if I was lucky. I'd done solo camping trips before. Yosemite, Joshua Tree, Big Sur. But never the deep Mojave. Never this far from civilization. Route 66 turned into Highway 40, then smaller roads with numbers instead of names. The kind of roads that don't show up on tourist maps. That's when the GPS started acting up. First, just minor glitches, then complete system failures. The screen would flicker between my location and some place called Restricted Area 51B, which made no sense because Area 51 was supposed to be in Nevada, not California. The temperature began dropping faster than it should have, even for desert spring weather. What had been a comfortable 75 degrees at noon was now hovering somewhere in the low 50s, and the sun hadn't even set yet. The Jeep's thermometer kept fluctuating wildly, showing readings that ranged from 32 degrees to over 90, sometimes within the span of a few minutes. By sunset, I was driving by instinct and a paper map I'd found in the glove compartment. One of those old AAA maps from 2018 with coffee stains and torn edges. According to the map, I was somewhere between Barstow and, well, nothing. Just empty space marked with tiny symbols I couldn't decipher. Some of the symbols looked hand-drawn, added after the map was printed. Triangular shapes with spirals inside them clustered around areas marked only as Geological Survey, Restricted Access. The sun dropped behind the mountains like a stone into black water, and suddenly the desert felt different. Colder. More aware. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the only way I can describe it. Like something was watching me from the darkness between the Joshua trees. The silence was wrong too, not the natural quiet of an empty landscape, but the deliberate hush of something holding its breath. My headlights seemed dimmer than they should have been, as if the darkness was somehow thicker here, more resistant to illumination. I noticed that the usual desert night sounds, the distant cry of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, were completely absent. Even the wind had died to an unnatural stillness. I found what looked like a decent campsite about a quarter-mile off the main road. Level ground, some rock formations for windbreak, far enough from the pavement that I wouldn't hear any late-night traffic. Perfect, except for the chain-link fence I almost didn't see until my headlights swept across it. Government property. No trespassing. Authorized personnel only. The usual warnings you'd expect near any military installation. But this fence looked old, rusted. Some sections were bent or broken, like something had pushed through from the inside. What disturbed me more was the way the metal seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even my high beams couldn't illuminate the area beyond the fence clearly. It was as if the darkness on the other side was somehow denser, more solid. I parked about 50 yards away and set up camp, figuring I was far enough to avoid any issues. As I worked, I noticed small details that should have sent me packing immediately. The ground around my campsite was littered with objects that didn't belong. Fragments of what looked like circuit boards, but made from materials I didn't recognize. Pieces of metal that felt warm to the touch despite the dropping temperature. And scattered throughout the area were small, perfectly round holes in the hard-packed earth, each about the size of a quarter and descending deeper than my flashlight beam could reach. That first night was quiet. Too quiet. In most places, desert nights are filled with sounds. Coyotes, owls, the rustle of small animals moving through the brush. But here? Nothing. Just the wind moving through the fence posts, creating this low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. The humming had an almost musical quality to it, like a chorus of voices singing just below the range of human hearing. I'd brought a small telescope, hoping to do some stargazing, but the view through the lens kept shifting. Stars would appear and disappear. Satellites moved in patterns that didn't make sense, sometimes stopping mid-orbit or reversing direction. The constellations themselves seemed wrong. Familiar patterns stretched and distorted, as if I were looking at the night sky through water. And sometimes I swear I saw lights moving on the ground beyond that fence. Lights that moved too purposefully to be natural, following geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Around midnight, I heard the first truck, The sound came from the direction of the main road. A deep diesel rumble that seemed to shake the ground beneath my sleeping bag. But there was something else mixed in with the engine noise. A high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache and set off a ringing in my ears that lasted for several minutes after the sound passed. I unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the darkness. Through the gap in the rock formations, I could see headlights. Not normal headlights. These were too bright, too blue-white, like the kind of LED arrays you see on emergency vehicles. But the light itself seemed to move independently of the vehicles, sweeping across the landscape in search patterns that followed no logical route. But these weren't emergency vehicles. The convoy consisted of 4 trucks, maybe 5. It was hard to tell in the darkness because the vehicles seemed to exist in a state of constant motion blur, even when they appeared to be stationary. They moved slowly, methodically, with no visible license plates and no military markings I could recognize, just flat, black paint that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As I watched through my binoculars, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The trucks weren't following the road. They were moving in a perfectly straight line across the desert floor, regardless of terrain. I watched one vehicle approach a large boulder, easily 10 feet tall and twice as wide. Instead of going around it, the truck simply passed through, like the rock wasn't there at all. They turned towards the fence, and I saw that each vehicle had something mounted on its roof. Not equipment I recognized from any military manual. These devices looked organic somehow, pulsing with internal light and moving with a fluid grace that suggested they were alive. One appeared to be scanning the area where I was camped, its beam sweeping back and forth in a pattern that made my eyes water to follow. A gate I hadn't noticed before opened automatically as the convoy approached. No guards, no checkpoint, just smooth mechanical precision that suggested this was a regular occurrence. But the gate itself was wrong. It didn't swing open or slide aside. Instead, the fence simply separated, the chain links unweaving themselves like a zipper opening, then weaving back together once the vehicles had passed through. The trucks disappeared into the restricted area, moving toward the structures I could now see silhouetted against the starless sky. Buildings that defied architectural logic, with angles that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Towers that spiraled upward in directions that shouldn't have been possible in 3-dimensional space. Then, silence again, but not the natural silence of the desert night. This was the artificial quiet of a recording studio, so complete it made my ears ring with phantom sounds. I should have packed up right then. Should have driven back to the main road and found a nice, normal campground with bathrooms and fire pits and families roasting marshmallows. But curiosity has always been my weakness, that, and the fact that my cell phone still had no signal and my GPS was now showing my location as temporal coordinates, error 404. The next morning brought new strangeness. My water bottles, which I'd left outside the tent, were covered in a fine layer of metallic dust. Not sand. Dust. It had a greenish tint and left a bitter taste when I accidentally got some on my fingers. The dust seemed to move on its own, swirling in patterns that defied the wind direction. When I tried to brush it off the bottles, it clung to my skin with an almost magnetic attraction, leaving intricate spiral patterns on my palms that took hours to fade. More concerning were the footprints. They circled my campsite in a perfect spiral, starting from the direction of the fence and ending just 3 feet from my tent. But they weren't human footprints. Too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the toe end. Each print was exactly 18 inches long and 4 inches wide, pressed into the hard-packed sand with enough force to create perfect impressions despite the rocky ground. But what disturbed me most was the spacing. The stride length was impossibly long, nearly 8 feet between steps. Whatever had made these tracks was either incredibly tall or moved in a way that defied human biomechanics. I took photos with my phone, but every image came out corrupted. Not just blurred, actively distorted, with geometric patterns overlaying the footprints that hurt to look at. The metadata showed impossible information, timestamps from dates that hadn't occurred yet, GPS coordinates that placed the photos simultaneously in multiple locations across 3 different continents. That afternoon, I decided to hike closer to the fence. Just to satisfy my curiosity, I told myself. Just to see what was so important that it needed this level of security in the middle of nowhere. The walk took longer than it should have. I'd estimated the distance at maybe a quarter mile, but after hiking for over an hour, the fence didn't seem any closer. It was as if the space between my campsite and the restricted area was somehow elastic, stretching with each step I took forward. When I finally reached the fence, I understood why my perception of distance had been so distorted. The barrier wasn't just tall, it extended upward far beyond what I'd initially seen, disappearing into a heat haze that shouldn't have existed in the cool desert air. The chain links themselves were wrong too, made from some kind of metal alloy that shifted color depending on the angle of view, cycling through shades of silver, copper, and something that wasn't quite purple but had no name in any language I knew. Every 20 yards or so, there were signs warning about lethal force and federal prosecution. But between the official warnings were other signs, hand-painted, weathered, barely legible. They're not what they say. The lights aren't stars. Don't let them see you watching. Time moves wrong here. Trust the old maps. If you hear your name, don't answer. Someone had been here before me. Multiple someones, judging by the different handwriting styles and varying degrees of weathering. Someone who'd seen enough to leave warnings. Someone who'd cared enough about future travelers to risk returning to this place to post their messages. As I walked along the fence line, I noticed something else. The ground inside the restricted area was different. Scorched in places, with patches of that same metallic dust I'd found on my water bottles. But the scorch marks followed patterns, intricate geometric designs that covered acres of desert floor, visible only from this elevated perspective near the fence. And there were structures in the distance, buildings that didn't look like any military installation I'd ever seen. Too smooth, too curved, like they'd been grown rather than built. Some appeared to be partially underground, with only their uppermost portions visible above the surface. Others defied gravity entirely, suspended in midair with no visible means of support. That's when I heard the voice. "You need to leave. Tonight." I spun around, heart hammering, but saw no one. Just empty desert stretching back toward my campsite. The voice had been close enough that I should have seen whoever spoke. Close enough that I could feel the warmth of their breath on the back of my neck. But the desert was empty. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish. My voice echoed off the rock formations, but the echo was wrong. Instead of fading naturally, it seemed to be repeated by something else, something that spoke with my voice but pronounced the words with subtly different inflections, as if learning to imitate human speech patterns. I started walking back toward camp, but the feeling of being watched intensified with every step. Several times I turned around, certain I'd see someone following me, but there was nothing. Just my own footprints in the sand and those strange, spiraling tracks that seemed to appear wherever I'd been. New ones, I realized. Fresh tracks that hadn't been there on my hike to the fence. The return journey took only 15 minutes, though I hadn't changed my pace or taken a different route. The elastic quality of space seemed to work in reverse when moving away from the restricted area, compressing distance and time in ways that made my head spin. Back at my campsite, I found my tent had been moved. Not dramatically, just shifted about 3 feet to the left. All my gear was exactly where I'd left it, nothing missing or disturbed. But the tent was definitely in a different position. The rock I'd used as an anchor point for one of the guy lines was now 2 feet away from where it should have been. More unsettling was the discovery that someone, or something, had been inside my tent. Not roughly searching through my belongings, but carefully examining everything. My sleeping bag had been unzipped and re-zipped, but the zipper pull was on the opposite side from where I'd left it. My journal lay open to a blank page, but the pen resting beside it was warm to the touch, as if it had recently been used. I flipped through the journal pages looking for any additions or changes and found something that made my hands shake. On a page I'd left completely blank, someone had written a single word in handwriting that looked almost like mine, but not quite. "Welcome." I checked my phone again. Still no signal, but the time display was wrong. According to the phone, it was 3:47 a.m., but the sun was clearly setting, which meant it should have been around 6:30 p.m. I tried resetting the phone, but it kept reverting to the same impossible time. Worse, the date had changed too. The screen now showed a date 3 days in the future. As darkness fell, I made a decision. I would stay one more night. Not because I wanted to, but because driving these unmarked desert roads in complete darkness seemed more dangerous than whatever was happening here. I'd leave first thing in the morning and find my way back to civilization. But first, I wanted to document what I was experiencing. I started a voice memo on my phone. Day 2 in the Mojave. Something's not right here. The military installation, if that's what it is, doesn't match any official records I can find. No base is supposed to exist in this area. The equipment I saw on those trucks, it didn't look like anything in current military inventory. More like experimental technology, or something else entirely. I paused the recording and looked toward the fence. Lights were moving again, but tonight they were closer and brighter, and they were definitely responding to my presence, shifting their search patterns whenever I moved or spoke. The lights are back, I continued into the phone. They're moving in formation now, almost like they're searching for something, or someone. I think they know I'm recording this. That's when I noticed my campfire had gone out. I hadn't built a campfire. There was a ring of stones around cold ashes about 10 feet from my tent, perfectly arranged, like someone had been camping here for days. But I'd been using a camp stove for cooking. I hadn't touched those rocks, hadn't lit any wood. The ashes were still warm. I grabbed a flashlight and examined the fire ring more closely. The stones weren't local. They were too smooth, too uniform, almost like they'd been manufactured. And carved into the surface of each stone was the same symbol I'd seen on those mysterious metal fragments. A spiral within a triangle, etched so finely it looked machine-made. But it was what I found in the ashes that truly frightened me. Partially burned fragments of paper, with writing that looked like my own handwriting. Pieces of what appeared to be journal entries describing experiences I'd never had, conversations with people I'd never met, and plans for activities I'd never considered. Day 7 at the site. The integration process is proceeding faster than expected. Told them about the others who came before. They understood, they always understand once the process begins. No longer remember why I thought leaving was important. The work here is too fascinating to abandon. The voice came again, closer this time. They know you're here now. You have maybe 2 hours before the next patrol. This time I saw him. An old man emerged from behind one of the larger rock formations, moving with the careful steps of someone who'd learned to walk silently. He was wearing military fatigues, but wrong ones. The pattern was slightly off, and there were no insignia or name tags. His face was weathered by years of desert sun, but his eyes were sharp and alert. What disturbed me most was how familiar he looked, like an older version of someone I'd seen before, though I couldn't place where. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Someone who should have left a long time ago," he replied. "Name's Carson. Staff Sergeant Carson officially, though officially I died in a training accident 6 years ago." He gestured toward the restricted area. "That's not a military base, son, at least not anymore. Started as one back in the 80s. Joint research project between the Air Force and some civilian contractors. Officially, it was shut down in 2003. Officially. What happened to it?" Carson sat down on one of the rocks, his movements suggesting old injuries and older fears. "They found something out here. Something that was already here, buried in the desert for, well, longer than anyone wants to think about. The research project became a containment operation. Then the containment failed." He pointed to the fence. "Those patrols you've been seeing, they're not military, not anymore. Haven't been human for quite some time." Carson's words should have sounded crazy. Should have made me pack up immediately and drive back to civilization. But sitting there in the desert darkness, surrounded by impossible evidence, they sounded like the first honest thing I'd heard in days. "What do you mean, not human?" I asked. "Hard to explain. Easier to show you, but that would be dangerous. For both of us." He pulled out what looked like a military radio, but the design was wrong. Too many buttons, too many frequencies. The display showed readings I didn't recognize, numbers that changed too quickly to track, symbols that hurt to look at directly. They adapt, you see, learn. The first ones we encountered were clearly other, different. But each generation gets better at mimicking human behavior, human appearance. He tuned the radio to a frequency that filled the air with static and something else. Something that sounded almost like voices speaking in reverse. But underneath the backward speech, I could hear familiar words, spoken in familiar voices. My own voice, my roommate's voice, my mother's voice, all saying things we'd never said, having conversations that had never happened. That's their communication frequency. Took me 3 years to figure out how to access it. Another 2 to understand what I was hearing. Carson's voice dropped to a whisper. "They're not from somewhere else, son. They're from somewhen else. This whole area. It's not just restricted, it's temporally unstable." The lights beyond the fence were moving again, but now I could see them more clearly. They weren't vehicles at all. They were entities, beings that glowed with their own internal light, moving in patterns that suggested intelligence but not humanity. And they were getting closer to the fence, drawn by our conversation. "The military tried to study them," Carson continued. "Tried to communicate. That was the mistake. Communication implies exchange, and they were very interested in human biology, human consciousness, human memory." I thought about the footprints around my campsite, the moved tent, the impossible time on my phone, the journal entry I'd never written. "They've been studying me. Testing you," Carson corrected. "Seeing how you react to different stimuli, the moved camp, the false fire ring, the time distortions. It's all data collection. They're trying to understand how human minds process impossible events, how we adapt, how we rationalize, how we remember. Why?" Carson stood up and shouldered his pack. "Because they're planning something. Something that requires them to pass undetected in human society. And the best way to learn how to be human is to study humans who are isolated, stressed, and experiencing phenomena that can't be easily reported or believed." The static from the radio suddenly shifted, becoming more focused, more urgent, and I realized I could understand some of the backward speech now. It was a countdown in multiple languages, all reaching 0 at the same time. "They know I'm here," Carson said. "I've stayed too long, and you need to leave, right now. What about you? I've been running from them for 6 years. I know how to disappear." He handed me a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit, but with additional components I didn't recognize, crystalline structures that pulsed with soft light, copper wiring arranged in spirals that seemed to move on their own. This will get you back to the main highway. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't talk to anyone about what you've seen for at least 72 hours. They have ways of monitoring communications. I started to ask more questions, but Carson was already moving away, disappearing into the darkness between the rocks with practiced ease. Just before he vanished completely, he called back, "Whatever happens, don't trust your memories of this place. They're not all yours anymore." The radio in his abandoned pack crackled with that reverse voice static, and I could swear I heard my own name mixed in with the alien syllables, not just Jake, but variations I'd never heard. Jake that was, Jake that will be, Jake that never was. I broke camp in record time, shoving gear into the Jeep without bothering to organize anything. The device Carson had given me was already displaying a route back to Highway 40, a route that didn't match any roads I remembered taking to get here. The path it showed seemed to twist back on itself, following impossible geometries that shouldn't have been navigable in a standard vehicle. As I drove away, following the pulsing guidance of Carson's device, I checked my rearview mirror one last time. The lights were following me, but they weren't just lights anymore. In the mirror, I could see shapes, tall, elongated figures that moved with fluid grace across the desert floor. They kept pace with the Jeep effortlessly, despite my increasing speed. And as I watched, one of them began to change, its form shifting and solidifying into something more familiar. Something that looked like me. The device guided me along roads that didn't exist on any map, through landscapes that changed from desert to forest to urban sprawl without any logical transition. Time moved strangely. Sometimes hours would pass in what felt like minutes. Other times, a few seconds would stretch into what seemed like eternity. When I finally reached Highway 40, the sun was rising, though my watch showed it was still the middle of the night. The device Carson had given me powered down with the soft chime, and suddenly I was back in normal space-time, surrounded by the familiar landmarks of the modern world. But I wasn't unchanged. 3 years later, I'm a graduate student at UCLA, specializing in desert ecology. On the surface, it's because I want to understand the ecosystems I experienced during that camping trip. Really, it's because I'm looking for answers. I've spent countless hours researching military installations in the Mojave. Official records show no permanent bases in the area where I camped. No research facilities, no training grounds, nothing. But satellite images from the past decade show clear signs of construction and activity in that exact location. Structures that appear and disappear between imaging sessions. Roads that exist in some photos but not others. Geometric patterns in the sand that seem to shift and evolve over time. More disturbing are the missing persons reports. 17 people have disappeared in that area over the past 8 years. Hikers, campers, photographers, all experienced outdoors enthusiasts who should have known better than to get lost in familiar terrain. The search and rescue reports all mention the same details. Abandoned campsites with signs of prolonged occupation, equipment arranged in patterns that suggest multiple days of use, and GPS devices that show impossible location data. But it's the personal belongings left behind that haunt me. Journals filled with handwriting that gradually shifts from the victim's own to something else entirely. Photographs that show the missing person in locations they never visited, with people they never met. Voice recordings of conversations with entities that speak in the victim's own voice, but with subtle differences that become more pronounced over time. I've tried to go back twice. Both times, my GPS has malfunctioned exactly 17 miles from where I estimate the campsite was located. Both times, I found myself on roads that don't appear on any map, heading toward destinations that don't exist. And both times, Carson's device has activated automatically, guiding me away from danger I can sense but not see. But the device is changing too. The crystalline components are growing, spreading through the casing like some kind of technological cancer. The displays show more information now, not just navigation, but warnings about temporal fluctuations, consciousness infiltration, and something it calls identity cascade events. Carson's device still works, but now it only shows one route: away from the desert, away from that fence, away from whatever is growing stronger behind those restricted area signs. But sometimes, late at night, it displays other messages, coordinates for locations around the world, dates and times that haven't happened yet, names of people I've never met, along with detailed instructions for how to find them. Last week I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, there was only static, but underneath the white noise, I could hear something that sounded like my own voice, speaking words I'd never said. The study is complete. Phase 2 can begin. I changed my phone number the next day, changed my apartment 2 days after that. But I know it won't matter. Whatever I encountered in the Mojave isn't done with me yet. It's been patient, methodical, studying not just my reactions, but my entire life. Learning to be me better than I am. The signs are subtle but growing stronger. I'll catch my reflection behaving differently than it should, moving a fraction of a second behind or ahead of my actual movements. Friends mention conversations we've had that I don't remember. My journal contains entries in my handwriting describing events that never happened, yet the details are so vivid, so consistent with my writing style and personal experiences, that sometimes I'm not sure whether I wrote them or not. And if you're thinking about dismissing this story, if you're planning your own desert camping trip, just remember this. The government puts up those restricted area signs for a reason. Sometimes it's to keep you away from sensitive military equipment. Sometimes it's to keep sensitive military equipment away from you. But sometimes it's to keep something else entirely from spreading beyond those fence lines. Something that's been waiting in the deep desert for longer than human civilization. Something that's learned to be patient. Something that's learned to be human. The lights are still moving out there in the darkness. They're still learning, still adapting. And they're not just studying isolated campers anymore. They're studying all of us, through every camera, every microphone, every digital connection that links our modern world together. Carson was wrong about one thing. They don't need to pass undetected in human society. They're already here. So, if you find yourself driving through the Mojave Desert, if your GPS starts malfunctioning, and you see signs for restricted areas that aren't supposed to exist, turn around. Drive back to the main highway. Find a nice, crowded campground with plenty of other people around. Don't camp in the Mojave Desert. The military base isn't what they say it is, and neither are the things that guard it. And if you've read this far, if you've absorbed every detail and felt that familiar chill of recognition, check your reflection tonight. Look carefully at the way it moves, because they're always watching, always learning, always becoming. Story number 4. The envelope had my name on it, written in my own handwriting. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. It was postmarked 3 days from now, 3 days in the future. And inside was a letter I swear I never wrote, warning me about tonight, warning me to stay awake, warning me that if I fall asleep tonight, I might not wake up as myself. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I've been sitting here for the past 6 hours, turning this letter over in my hands, questioning my own sanity. But I need to tell someone about this. I need to document what's happening before whatever's supposed to happen tonight actually happens. So, if you're listening to this, please stay with me until the end, because I have a feeling that by the time this story is over, we're both going to need answers. The story is now going to start. My name is David Chen, and I live in a small apartment complex in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Nothing special about it, just your typical Midwest college town where the most exciting thing that happens is when the local Dairy Queen changes their flavor of the month. I work as a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend most of my time in my cramped home office, staring at a computer screen until my eyes burn. Tuesday started like any other day. I was expecting a package from Amazon, some new wireless headphones I'd ordered for work. The delivery notification said it had been left by my door around noon, but when I went to grab it, there were 2 packages waiting for me. One was clearly from Amazon, that familiar brown cardboard box with the Smile logo, but the other was different. It was a small manila envelope, no return address, just my name written in careful block letters across the front. David Chen, Apartment 3B, 1247 Elm Street, Cedar Falls, IA 52241. I picked up both packages and headed back inside. The Amazon box could wait, but something about that manila envelope made my hand shake slightly as I carried it to my kitchen table. The handwriting looked familiar. Too familiar. I set it down and just stared at it for a moment. The way the D in David curved slightly to the left. The way the N in Chen was written with that little extra flourish at the end. These were small details, quirks in penmanship that I'd developed over years of signing documents and writing notes to myself. But that was impossible. I hadn't sent myself any mail. I flipped the envelope over. And that's when I saw the postmark. October 15th, 2025. Today was October 12th. My kitchen suddenly felt colder. The afternoon sunlight streaming through my window seemed dimmer somehow. I live alone, no girlfriend, no roommate, no family nearby. Just me and the occasional visit from Mrs. Patterson next door when she needs help reaching something on a high shelf. I grabbed a butter knife from the drawer and carefully sliced open the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. My hands were definitely shaking now as I unfolded it. The letter was written in the same handwriting as the envelope. My handwriting, but the words made my stomach drop. David, I don't have much time to explain this, and I know you're going to think you're losing your mind when you read this. Hell, I thought I was losing mine when I wrote it. But you need to listen to me, to us, to yourself. Tonight, October 12th, something is going to happen. Something that started 3 days ago but hasn't finished yet. I know that doesn't make sense, but time isn't working the way it should be. Whatever you do, do not fall asleep tonight. I can't explain everything in this letter, but falling asleep is how it gets in, how it takes over, how it becomes you while you become something else. Check the mirror in your bathroom at exactly 11:47 p.m. You'll see what I mean. But don't look too long, and don't let it see you looking. There are others like us, others who figured it out. Mrs. Patterson knows more than she lets on. Ask her about the previous tenant in 3B. Ask her why the lease was available so quickly. I'm leaving this letter in the only window of time I could find. A small gap where things reset, but memories bleed through. By the time you read this, I'll be different. But maybe you can break the cycle. Maybe you can be the one who doesn't become what I became. Stay awake, David. Whatever happens, stay awake. You, but not the you that you'll become. P.S. Check under the loose floorboard by your bedroom window. I left you something that might help. The letter slipped from my hands and fluttered to the floor. I sat there in my kitchen chair, staring at it, trying to process what I'd just read. Every rational part of my brain was screaming that this was some kind of elaborate prank. Maybe one of my college friends had somehow gotten a sample of my handwriting and was messing with me. But the details, The specific details about Mrs. Patterson, about the apartment, about things that only I would know, those details made the rational explanation start to crumble. I glanced at the clock on my microwave. 2:17 p.m. If the letter was telling the truth, I had less than 10 hours before whatever was supposed to happen at 11:47 p.m. My hands were still trembling as I picked up the letter and read it again. Then again. Each time, new details jumped out at me. The way the ink changed color, slightly halfway through, as if the pen had been running low. The small coffee stain in the bottom right corner. A ring that looked exactly like the marks my favorite mug leaves on paper. I needed answers, and according to the letter, Mrs. Patterson might have them. Mrs. Patterson is one of those neighbors you see in old movies, the kind who always has fresh cookies cooling on her windowsill and knows everyone's business whether they want her to or not. She's lived in apartment 3A, right next to mine, for the past 15 years. Sweet lady, probably in her 70s, with silver hair always pulled back in a neat bun, and these sharp green eyes that seem to notice everything. I knocked on her door at 2:45 p.m., the letter folded and tucked into my back pocket like some kind of talisman. "David," she said when she opened the door, but her smile seemed forced. What a pleasant surprise. Come in, I was just making some tea." Her apartment was the mirror image of mine, but where my place was cluttered with computer equipment and takeout containers, hers was immaculate. Doilies on every surface, family photos covering the walls, and the persistent smell of lavender and something else, something metallic that I couldn't quite identify. "Mrs. Patterson," I started, accepting the cup of chamomile tea she offered me, "I need to ask you about something, about the previous tenant in my apartment." Her hands stilled on her teacup. For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, she was completely motionless. Then she set her cup down with a slight clink against the saucer. "Previous tenant?" she asked, but her voice sounded different. Careful. "Yes, the letter I got today. It mentioned that you might know something about why the lease was available so quickly." I watched her face carefully, looking for any sign that this was all some elaborate joke. But what I saw in her expression made my chest tighten with fear. Recognition. And something else. Pity. "David," she said slowly. "What letter?" I pulled the envelope from my pocket and showed her the postmark. Her green eyes went wide, and she actually gasped. A sharp intake of breath that made me jump slightly. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "It was delivered to my door today, along with my Amazon package." She stood up quickly, walked to her window and peered through the blinds at something I couldn't see. "What time is it?" she asked without turning around. "Almost 3 o'clock. We don't have much time then." She turned back to me and I could see that her hands were shaking now too. "David, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The man who lived in your apartment before you, his name was Marcus. Marcus Webb." She walked over to an old wooden cabinet and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, and what looked like police reports. Marcus moved in about 2 years ago. Quiet guy, kept to himself, just like you. Worked from home doing some kind of computer work, and for the first few months everything was normal. She handed me a photograph. It showed a man about my age, with dark hair and tired eyes, standing in front of what was definitely my apartment building. Then strange things started happening. Packages delivered to his door that he never ordered. Letters with postmarks from dates that hadn't happened yet. And Marcus started talking about mirrors, about reflections that didn't quite match what they should show. My blood was rushing in my ears now. The teacup felt impossibly heavy in my hands. What happened to him? Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. She sat back down, suddenly looking every one of her 70-something years. He disappeared on a Tuesday night in October 12th to be exact. The police said there was no sign of a struggle, no indication of where he might have gone, but I knew something was wrong because I could still hear him moving around in the apartment. For 3 days after he was officially reported missing, I could hear footsteps, hear the TV, hear normal apartment sounds coming from 3B. She leaned forward, lowering her voice to almost a whisper. But when the police broke down the door on October 15th, they found the apartment completely empty. Not just empty of Marcus, empty of everything. No furniture, no personal belongings, no sign that anyone had ever lived there at all. Just 4 bare walls and a postcard lying on the kitchen floor. What did the postcard say? It had a picture of Cedar Falls on the front, and on the back, in handwriting that looked exactly like Marcus's, it said, "The lease is now available. New tenant needed immediately." I set my teacup down so hard that some of the liquid sloshed onto her coffee table. My mouth felt dry despite the chamomile tea. "Mrs. Patterson, how did you know to ask me about the letter?" She smiled sadly, and I noticed that there were tears gathering in the corners of her green eyes. "Because this is the 3rd time, David. Marcus was the 2nd. Before him, there was a young woman named Sarah. Same pattern, same timeline, same ending, and before Sarah," she paused, wiping at her eyes. "Before Sarah, it was my grandson Tommy." The room felt like it was spinning slightly. I gripped the arms of the chair I was sitting in, trying to anchor myself to something solid. "Your grandson?" Tommy was the first person I noticed this happening to. That's why I've stayed in this apartment for 15 years, even though I could afford to move somewhere nicer. I stay because I keep hoping that someday one of you will be strong enough to break the cycle. She reached across the table and grabbed my hands with her weathered ones. They were surprisingly warm. "David, I need you to understand something. Whatever is in that apartment, whatever is using apartment 3B as some kind of doorway, it's getting stronger with each person it takes, more sophisticated, better at mimicking human behavior. But why? What does it want? I don't know, but I think it's collecting people, storing them somehow. Because sometimes late at night I can hear all of them moving around in that apartment. Marcus and Sarah and Tommy, all of them, walking around like they're living their normal lives. But they're not alive, David. They're echoes." I left Mrs. Patterson's apartment at 4:30 p.m. with a head full of information I didn't want and a growing certainty that I was either losing my mind or about to become the 4th person to disappear from apartment 3B. But first, I needed to check under the loose floorboard. My bedroom is small, just enough space for a double bed, a dresser, and a narrow window that looks out onto the parking lot. I'd noticed the floorboard by the window before. It creaked whenever I stepped on it, and I'd made a mental note to mention it to the landlord, but I'd never bothered to actually examine it. Now, kneeling next to my bed, I could see that the board was indeed loose. Not just creaky. Actually loose, like it had been pried up recently. I used a butter knife to lift one edge, and underneath I found a small metal box, the kind you might use to store important documents. Inside the box were 3 items: a digital camera, a notebook filled with handwriting that looked like mine, and a small handheld mirror. I opened the notebook first. The entries were dated, starting from October 9th and ending abruptly on October 12th. My handwriting, but describing experiences I'd never had. October 9th. Something's wrong with my reflection. This morning, I was brushing my teeth, and for just a second my reflection in the bathroom mirror was brushing its hair instead. When I stopped and looked directly at it, everything was normal again. October 10th. It's getting bolder. Today, I caught my reflection waving at me when I wasn't waving back. I tried to record it with my phone, but the video just shows me standing normally in front of the mirror. Whatever this is, technology can't capture it. October 11th. I figured out the pattern. Every night at 11:47 p.m., my reflection becomes independent. It moves on its own, acts on its own, and I swear it's trying to communicate with me. But I'm afraid to let it. I'm afraid of what it might want. October 12th. This is my last entry. Tonight, I'm going to try to break the cycle. I'm going to stay awake and confront whatever is in that mirror. If you're reading this, it means I failed. But maybe you can succeed where I couldn't. The handheld mirror shows the truth. Use it at 11:47 p.m., and whatever you do, don't let it see you looking. The handwriting stopped there mid-sentence, as if whoever was writing had been interrupted. I picked up the digital camera and scrolled through the photos. Most of them were normal. Pictures of my apartment, the bathroom mirror, the bedroom window. But the last few photos made my hands shake again. They showed my bathroom at night, taken from the doorway. In the mirror's reflection, I could see a figure that looked like me, but the figure was facing the wrong direction. While the camera was pointed at the mirror from the doorway, my reflection was facing sideways, as if looking at something outside the frame of the mirror. And in the very last photo, my reflection was pointing at the camera. I set the camera down and picked up the handheld mirror. It was old, antique maybe, with an ornate silver handle and what looked like genuine silver backing. When I looked into it, I saw exactly what I expected to see. My own face, pale and frightened, staring back at me. But there was something else, something subtle. In the handheld mirror, my apartment looked different. The walls seemed slightly darker. The shadows fell at odd angles, and I could swear I saw movement in the peripheral edges of the reflection. I checked the clock on my nightstand, 6:15 p.m. 5.5 hours until 11:47 p.m. I spent the next few hours trying to prepare for what? I didn't even know what I was preparing for. I made coffee, strong coffee. I charged my phone, my laptop, and every electronic device I owned. I turned on every light in the apartment. I moved all the mirrors except the bathroom mirror into my bedroom closet and shut the door. At 9 p.m., I called in sick to work for the next day. I didn't know if I'd still be myself by morning, but I figured it was better to be safe. At 10 p.m., I tried calling my parents in California. I don't know what I was planning to say. Maybe just to hear their voices one more time in case, but they didn't answer. It was 8 p.m. their time, and they were probably out at their weekly dinner with friends. At 10:30 p.m., I heard Mrs. Patterson's door open and close. Footsteps in the hallway. A gentle knock on my door. "David?" Her voice came through the door. "I brought you something." I opened the door to find her holding a thermos and a small cloth bag. "Coffee," she said, handing me the thermos. "And this," she pressed the cloth bag into my hands. "Salt, pure salt. Spread it in front of your bathroom door at 11:45. It won't stop what's coming, but it might slow it down." "Mrs. Patterson, if this has happened 3 times before, why haven't you called the police? Or moved away? Or—" She smiled sadly. "Because I love my grandson, David. And Marcus was a sweet boy, and Sarah reminded me of myself when I was young. They're still in there somehow. Still trapped. And I keep hoping that someday someone will be strong enough to save them." She reached up and patted my cheek with her weathered hand. "Be careful tonight. And remember, whatever you see in that mirror, it's not really you." At 11:30 p.m., I spread the salt in front of my bathroom door, like Mrs. Patterson had instructed. The small granules caught the hallway light, creating a thin white line between me and whatever was waiting in the bathroom mirror. At 11:40 p.m., I positioned myself in my bedroom doorway, holding the handheld mirror and the digital camera. I could see the bathroom mirror from this angle, a narrow slice of reflective surface that had been showing me my own face for the past 8 months without incident. At 11:45 p.m., I started the voice recording app on my phone. If something happened to me, maybe someone would find the recording, maybe it would help the next person. At 11:47 p.m., exactly 11:47 p.m., everything changed. It started with the bathroom mirror going dark. Not reflecting darkness, actually dark, like someone had turned off a TV screen. For maybe 10 seconds, the mirror surface was completely black. Then my reflection appeared. But it was wrong. My reflection was standing in a bathroom that wasn't my bathroom. The walls behind it were a different color. A sickly green instead of the off-white I'd painted them last spring. The lighting was dimmer, coming from sources I couldn't see. And my reflection was smiling. I lifted the handheld mirror and looked into it. What I saw made me drop the digital camera. In the handheld mirror, I could see my bathroom as it really was at that moment. And it wasn't empty. There were people in my bathroom. 3 people, standing behind where my reflection should be. A young woman with blonde hair and tired eyes. A man about my age with dark hair and a confused expression. And a younger man, barely out of his teens, who looked enough like Mrs. Patterson that he had to be Tommy. They were all staring directly at me through the handheld mirror, and they were all mouthing the same word, run. But I couldn't run, because my reflection in the bathroom mirror was no longer smiling. It was pointing at me. And as I watched, it started to climb out of the mirror, not metaphorically, not in some dreamlike, surreal way. Literally climbing out of the mirror, one leg swinging over the edge of the frame, then the other, until it was standing in my bathroom, facing the doorway where I stood. The thing that looked like me tilted its head, studying me with eyes that were my eyes but somehow emptier. When it spoke, it used my voice, but the words came out just slightly off, like an actor who'd learned their lines phonetically without understanding the language. "Hello, David," it said. "We've been waiting for you." I looked down at the handheld mirror again. The 3 people trapped in the reflection were gesturing frantically now, pointing at something behind the mirror thing. I followed their gaze and saw it. Saw what they were trying to warn me about. The bathroom mirror wasn't just a doorway, it was a window. And on the other side of that window was a room that looked like a twisted version of my apartment. There were dozens of people in that room, men and women of different ages, all wearing expressions of confused terror, all moving around like they were living their normal lives but couldn't remember how they'd gotten there. All of them had been tenants of apartment 3B. The mirror thing took a step toward me, and I heard the salt crunch under its feet. It looked down at the white line, then back at me, and its empty smile grew wider. "Clever," it said in my voice, "but salt only works on spirits. I'm not a spirit, David. I'm you, a better version of you." It took another step, crushing more salt under feet that looked exactly like mine. "You don't have to be afraid," it continued. "The transition is peaceful. You'll join the others, and I'll take over your life. Your job, your routines, your occasional phone calls with your parents. I'll be a perfect David, more perfect than you ever were." I raised the handheld mirror between us like a shield. In its surface, I could see that the 3 trapped people were no longer just mouthing words. They were screaming. "Why?" I managed to ask. "What do you want?" The mirror thing paused, considering the question with my face. "Experience," it said finally. "Life. Sensation. Your kind takes it all for granted. The feeling of coffee in the morning, the warmth of sunlight, the simple pleasure of breathing. We want to know what it feels like to be real. But you're killing people, trapping them. Are we?" It tilted its head again. "Look in your mirror, David. Really look. Are they dead? Or are they more alive than they've ever been?" I looked. In the handheld mirror, I could see the room behind the bathroom mirror more clearly now. And the mirror thing was right. The people trapped there weren't just existing. They were living. Living the same day over and over again, but living it perfectly. No sadness, no fear, no uncertainty. Just the pure experience of being human, distilled and repeated endlessly. "It's not real," I whispered. "Reality is overrated," the mirror thing replied, taking another step forward. "In there, you'll never have to worry about paying rent, or whether your work is good enough, or if your parents are disappointed in you. You'll just exist, perfectly." I thought about my life, my real life. The endless cycle of work and sleep and work and sleep. The loneliness of living alone in a small apartment in a small town. The constant, low-level anxiety about money, about the future, about whether I was wasting my life. For just a moment, just one moment, the mirror thing's offer sounded tempting. But then I looked at the handheld mirror again and saw Tommy, Mrs. Patterson's grandson, trapped for 15 years in a perfect simulation of life. And I thought about Mrs. Patterson, staying in apartment 3A all these years, hoping someone would be strong enough to save him. "No," I said. The mirror thing's smile faltered. "No," it repeated, as if the concept was foreign. "I choose my imperfect life over your perfect prison." I raised the handheld mirror higher, angling it so that it reflected the bathroom mirror behind the mirror thing. In that double reflection, I could see something the mirror thing couldn't. The trapped people weren't just screaming anymore, they were reaching toward the surface of their prison, toward the weak point where two mirrors created an infinite loop. "You can't stop this, David," the mirror thing said, but there was uncertainty in my voice now. "Every October 12th, the cycle repeats. Every 3 days, reality resets. You can't change what's already happened." "Maybe not," I said, "but I can change what happens next." I smashed the handheld mirror against the floor. The effect was immediate. The bathroom mirror exploded outward in a shower of glass, and I heard voices, real voices. Tommy and Marcus and Sarah and dozens of others, suddenly free from their perfect prison, their words overlapping in a cacophony of confused relief. The mirror thing looked down at its hands, my hands, and they were starting to fade, becoming transparent. "This isn't possible," it said, but its voice was growing fainter. "The cycle can't be broken. It's already happened." "Time isn't a circle," I said, surprised by my own certainty. "It's a spiral, and sometimes the spiral breaks." The mirror thing opened its mouth to respond, but no sound came out. It was dissolving, fading away like smoke in the wind, and then it was gone. I'm recording this epilogue on October 15th, 3 days after I broke the cycle. 3 days after I should have disappeared like the others. The apartment management company called yesterday. They said they needed to inspect apartment 3B due to unusual reports from other tenants. When they arrived, they found something interesting. The bathroom mirror had been completely replaced with a newer model. No one could explain who had done the work or when it had been completed. Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door this morning with tears in her eyes and a young man beside her. A young man who looked exactly like the Tommy I'd seen trapped in the mirror. "He doesn't remember the last 15 years, she whispered to me while Tommy explored her apartment like he was seeing it for the first time. To him, it's still October 12th, 2009. But he's free, David. He's really free." I asked her about Marcus and Sarah. She smiled and handed me 2 newspaper clippings. The first showed Marcus Webb accepting an award for his graphic design work in Minneapolis. The article was dated yesterday. The second showed Sarah Martinez opening her own bakery in Portland, Oregon. Also dated yesterday. "They don't remember being trapped either," Mrs. Patterson explained. "It's like they just continued living from where they left off, but in different places, with new opportunities, better lives." I don't pretend to understand what happened that night. I don't know what the mirror things were, or where they came from, or why they chose apartment 3B, but I do know one thing. Sometimes, the only way to break a cycle is to accept that not every story has a logical explanation. The new bathroom mirror shows exactly what it should show. My own reflection. Moving when I move, smiling when I smile. No independence. No agenda of its own. But sometimes, late at night, I catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Shadows that don't quite match the objects casting them. Reflections that linger for just a moment longer than they should. I think they're still out there. The mirror things. Looking for new doorways, new apartments, new cycles to start. So, if you ever find yourself living alone in a small apartment, if you ever receive a package you didn't order with a postmark from the future, if you ever notice your reflection acting just slightly off, remember my story. Remember that cycles can be broken. Remember that sometimes the most important choice you can make is to choose your imperfect reality over someone else's perfect lie. And whatever you do, don't let it see you looking. But here's the thing that still keeps me awake at night. That still makes me question everything I think I know about what happened. Yesterday, I received another package. Same manila envelope, same handwriting, same impossible postmark from 3 days in the future. Inside was a single photograph. A picture of me sitting in my bedroom recording this very story. But in the background of the photo, in the reflection of my computer screen, I can see someone else. Someone who looks exactly like me standing behind my chair, smiling. The photograph came with a note. "Thanks for the practice run, David. See you next October." I've been staring at this photo for 6 hours now, and I can't shake the feeling that I didn't break the cycle after all. I just postponed it. What do you think? Was I really the hero of this story, or was I just another chapter in something much bigger? Something that's still happening? Let me know in the comments. Because, honestly, I'm starting to think I'm going to need all the help I can get.